Someone's been calling about your children's inheritance, my mother's estate attorney said during an urgent phone call. Your ex-wife and a man claiming to be their stepfather want access to the trust funds. They're saying you've relinquished parental rights. My hands shook as I realized what Sarah and her new husband were attempting. Legal theft of my kid's future. My name is Shane Daniels, 35 years old, and I'm a project manager for a construction company in Atlanta, Georgia. 2 years ago, I thought my biggest challenge was rebuilding my life after a difficult divorce. I had no idea that my ex-wife Sarah and her new husband would eventually try to steal the inheritance I'd secured for my children through the most calculated scheme I'd ever encountered. The story begins 4 years ago when my marriage to Sarah Collins began falling apart. We'd been together for 8 years, married for 6, and had 2 beautiful children together, Emma, now 12, and Jake, now 10. Our relationship deteriorated as we developed different priorities. Sarah wanted an expensive lifestyle, while I preferred financial stability and building wealth for our kids' futures. The tension escalated when my mother passed away unexpectedly from a stroke in early 2022. Mom had been successful in real estate investment, building a portfolio worth approximately $800,000. She'd established trust funds for both children, with $200,000 designated for each child's education and future needs. The trusts were structured so money would be available for educational expenses immediately, with remaining funds accessible when each child turned 25. Most importantly, the trust named me as sole trustee with complete authority over management and distribution. Sarah's reaction was immediate and revealing. Instead of being grateful that our children's futures were secured, she was angry that the money wasn't directly accessible for immediate use. She argued we should use the trust funds to upgrade our lifestyle and pay off debts. Your mother was being controlling even from the grave, Sarah said bitterly. We're their parents. We should decide how the money's used. The trust fund disputes became symbolic of our deeper incompatibilities. Within 6 months of Mom's death, Sarah filed for divorce. We agreed to joint custody, with children spending weekdays with Sarah and weekends with me, while I retained my role as trustee of the inheritance trusts. The custody arrangement worked well initially. Emma and Jake adjusted to splitting time between 2 households, and Sarah and I maintained a civil relationship focused on co-parenting effectively. I thought we'd successfully navigated the divorce while protecting our children's interests and financial security. 8 months after our divorce, Sarah met Richard Brennan at a charity fundraiser. Richard was a 45-year-old insurance broker who'd been divorced twice with no children. He was financially successful and immediately interested in the ready-made family Sarah could provide. Their relationship moved quickly. Within 4 months, Richard had moved into Sarah's house and was playing an active role in Emma and Jake's lives. The children liked him. He was fun, generous with gifts, and seemed genuinely interested in their activities. I was cautiously supportive, hoping Richard would provide Sarah with stability that would benefit everyone. But I began noticing troubling changes in my children's attitudes about money during our weekend visits. Emma started asking about Grandma's money and when she'd be able to use it. Jake mentioned that Richard had explained how trust funds worked and suggested there might be ways to access the money sooner. When I asked where they'd learned about trust funds, they mentioned Richard had been teaching them about financial planning. He'd told them that sometimes parents had to make difficult decisions about children's money, and that love meant wanting kids to benefit from inheritance immediately rather than waiting years. I realized Richard was influencing my children's understanding of their inheritance in ways that served his and Sarah's interests rather than the children's long-term benefit. 6 months after Richard moved in, my attorney called asking whether I'd made changes to the children's trust arrangements. Someone had contacted the estate attorney's office asking about procedures for modifying trust terms and changing trustee responsibilities. I began paying closer attention to conversations during weekend visits, listening for mentions of money or financial planning discussions. What I discovered was disturbing. Richard wasn't just casually teaching my children about money. He was systematically indoctrinating them with ideas that would justify accessing their inheritance immediately. Richard says Dad's being mean by making us wait for Grandma's money, Jake told me innocently. He says if we really need something, there should be ways to get the money sooner. I decided to document any attempts to manipulate the trust funds by recording conversations during family exchanges. The recordings revealed Richard's true intentions. He was actively planning to gain control over the inheritance through legal maneuvering. In one recorded conversation, Sarah and Richard discussed restructuring Shane's control over the money so they could access funds for legitimate family needs. They talked about legal options for challenging trust arrangements and demonstrating that immediate access would benefit the children more than waiting. Most shocking was when I overheard Richard discussing adoption procedures on the phone, exploring the possibility of legally adopting Emma and Jake to gain parental rights that could challenge my role as trustee. The crisis came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2024, when I received the phone call that confirmed my worst fears and started the clock ticking on protecting my children's financial future. The call came from Patricia Morrison, the estate attorney who'd handled my mother's will and established the trust funds for Emma and Jake. "Shane," she said urgently, "I need to speak with you immediately about your children's inheritance." My heart started racing. Estate attorneys don't make urgent calls unless something serious is happening. "Someone's been calling about your children's inheritance," Patricia continued. "Your ex-wife and a man claiming to be their stepfather want access to the trust funds. They're saying you've relinquished parental rights and that he's now the legal guardian with authority over financial decisions." My hands shook as I processed what she was telling me. Sarah and Richard weren't just exploring ways to access the inheritance. They were actively lying to legal professionals about my parental status and Richard's authority over my children. "That's completely false," I told Patricia. "I haven't relinquished any parental rights. Richard has no legal authority over my children or their finances." "That's what I suspected," Patricia replied. "But they've been very persistent and have provided what appear to be official documents supporting their claims. I need you to come in immediately so we can verify your legal status and take action to protect the trust funds." After hanging up, I sat in my truck outside my office, trying to process the magnitude of what Sarah and Richard were attempting. They weren't just trying to access my children's inheritance, they were apparently forging legal documents and making false claims about my parental status to steal money that belonged to Emma and Jake. I immediately called my family law attorney, David Chen, and explained the situation. He asked me to come in that afternoon so we could review my custody agreements and parental rights documentation to ensure everything was properly protected. "Shane," David said after reviewing my legal status, "you need to understand how serious this is. If someone is falsely claiming you've relinquished parental rights, they're committing fraud that could affect your custody, your children's financial security, and your legal relationship with Emma and Jake." David advised me to take immediate action to document Richard and Sarah's scheme and to establish clear legal protections for both my parental rights and the children's inheritance. He also recommended contacting law enforcement about the apparent document forgery and false legal claims. That evening, during my regular video call with Emma and Jake, I carefully asked them about any recent conversations with Richard or Sarah about money, legal papers, or changes to our family situation. What they told me confirmed that the scheme was even more sophisticated than I'd realized. "Richard said we might be moving to a bigger house soon," Emma told me excitedly. "He says there's money available for better schools and more activities, but there might be some paperwork changes first." Jake added, "Mom said you might not be able to visit as much anymore because Richard's going to be our new legal dad. But she said it's better for everyone this way." My children were being systematically prepared for changes that would separate them from me while giving Richard legal authority over their lives and finances. Sarah and Richard weren't just stealing money. They were stealing my relationship with my children as part of their scheme. I realized I needed to take decisive action before Richard's adoption plans could be implemented or before any fraudulent legal claims about my parental status could be formalized through court proceedings. The next morning, I met with Patricia Morrison to review the trust documents and establish additional protections for the inheritance funds. We implemented new security measures that required multiple forms of identification and verification before any information about the trusts could be released to anyone. Patricia also provided me with detailed records of Richard and Sarah's contact with her office, including copies of the documents they'd submitted claiming that I'd relinquished parental rights. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that looked official, but contained errors that proved they were fraudulent. "These documents claim you signed over parental rights in front of a notary in Florida," Patricia explained. "But the notary's seal doesn't match official records, and the signatures don't match your signature on file with our office." I asked Patricia to preserve all evidence of the fraud attempt and to cooperate with law enforcement in any investigation of Richard and Sarah's scheme. That afternoon, I met with David Chen to review our legal options for protecting my parental rights and the children's inheritance. David recommended filing immediate court motions to establish clear documentation of my legal status and to seek injunctions against any attempts to modify the trust arrangements without proper authorization. "We're going to go on offense," David explained. "Instead of waiting for them to file fraudulent adoption papers or trust modifications, we're going to establish your rights proactively and expose their scheme before it can succeed." David filed emergency motions with the family court system, requesting expedited hearings to confirm my parental rights and to investigate any attempts to manipulate legal documentation related to my children. He also contacted the district attorney's office about potential criminal charges for document forgery and fraud. 3 days later, Richard and Sarah received legal notice that they were under investigation for attempted fraud related to inheritance theft and document forgery. They also received court orders requiring them to appear at hearings about their attempts to access the children's trust funds. Sarah called me that evening, furious about the legal actions and claiming there had been misunderstandings about their intentions. She accused me of overreacting to what she called legitimate attempts to ensure the children's financial security. "Shane, you're being paranoid," she said angrily. "Richard cares about Emma and Jake. We were just exploring ways to make sure they can benefit from the inheritance when they actually need money for school and activities." "Sarah," I replied calmly, "you and Richard forged documents claiming I'd relinquished parental rights. You lied to estate attorneys about his legal status. You've been manipulating our children to expect immediate access to money that's meant for their long-term security. This isn't about their benefit. This is about theft." The legal proceedings that followed revealed the full scope of Richard and Sarah's scheme. Investigation showed that Richard had been researching inheritance theft strategies online, consulting with attorneys about challenging trust arrangements, and even contacting private investigators about my personal life and financial situation. Most damaging was evidence that Richard and Sarah had been systematically preparing Emma and Jake for changes to our family structure that would reduce my role in their lives while increasing Richard's legal authority over their decisions and finances. The court hearings were devastating for Richard and Sarah's credibility. When confronted with evidence of their forged documents, false legal claims, and manipulation of the children, they couldn't provide coherent explanations for their actions. Richard's adoption petition was denied based on clear evidence that it was motivated by financial gain rather than the children's best interests. Sarah's attempts to modify the trust arrangements were blocked by the court, which found that her motivations were focused on adult financial benefit rather than protecting the children's inheritance. Most satisfying was the judge's ruling that Richard and Sarah's scheme represented a serious threat to the children's financial security and emotional well-being. The court implemented additional protections for the trust funds and established monitoring requirements for any future attempts to access or modify the inheritance arrangements. Sarah lost her request for increased custody time, and Richard was prohibited from participating in any legal or financial decisions affecting Emma and Jake. The court also ordered both of them to attend counseling about appropriate boundaries in blended family situations. The criminal investigation resulted in charges against Richard for document forgery and fraud. While the charges were eventually reduced through plea agreements, Richard received probation and was ordered to pay restitution for legal fees and investigative costs related to his scheme. 6 months after the legal crisis, my relationship with Emma and Jake had returned to normal. The court proceedings had been difficult for them to understand, but they gradually realized that Richard's helpfulness about their inheritance had actually been an attempt to steal money that belonged to them. Sarah and Richard's relationship didn't survive the stress of the legal problems and criminal charges. They separated within months of the court ruling, and Richard moved out of the house where he'd been planning to establish his new family with my children and their inheritance money. Today, Emma and Jake continue to benefit from the trust funds Mom established for their futures. The money has paid for educational opportunities, summer programs, and activities that will enhance their development and prepare them for successful adult lives. Most importantly, they understand that the inheritance represents their grandmother's love and sacrifice, not money that adults can access for immediate gratification. The experience taught me that protecting my children required more than just love and good intentions. It required legal vigilance and the willingness to investigate people who gained access to their lives and financial information. Richard's scheme failed because he underestimated both the legal protections Mom had established for the inheritance and my determination to preserve my children's financial security. He thought he could manipulate his way into my family and steal money that represented my mother's legacy to her grandchildren. The most important lesson from this experience is that inheritance theft often involves sophisticated schemes that target children through adults who gain access to family financial information. Richard wasn't just a stepfather seeking immediate benefits for his new family. He was a predator who saw my children's inheritance as an opportunity for personal enrichment. Protecting Emma and Jake's inheritance meant protecting their future opportunities, their relationship with their grandmother's memory, and their understanding that family money should serve their long-term interests rather than adult desires for immediate gratification. Sarah and Richard's scheme would have succeeded if I hadn't maintained active oversight of the trust arrangements and taken immediate action when their plans were discovered. Sometimes protecting your children's inheritance means being willing to fight people who claim to love them while actually planning to exploit them.